नमस्ते सर्वेभ्यः। अद्य अस्माकं युवचेतना वर्गस्य गेस्ट लेक्चर कार्यक्रमः अस्ति। अद्य अस्माकं कृते अस्माकं सौभाग्यमस्ति सुदर्शन महोदय सुदर्शन महोदयस्य परिचयः कारयितुम् इच्छामि। महोदय जन्म विद्याभ्यासादिकं बेंगलुरु नगरे एव कृतवान् अस्ति। दूरसम्पर्काभियन्त्रशास्त्रे स्नातकं प्राप्य, इत्युक्ते टेलिकॉम इंजीनियरिंग डिग्री प्राप्य संगणकक्षेत्रे दूरसम्पर्कक्षेत्रे च बहुवर्षेभ्यः सेवां कृत्वा सेवोद्यमी भूत्वा च कार्यं कृत्वा च कालानन्तरं ततः सेवानिवृत्तिं स्वीकृतवान्। तदनन्तरं संस्कृतम् अधीत्य स्नातकोत्तरपदवीं प्राप्य सम्प्रति भारतीय वैज्ञानिक इतिहास क्षेत्रे कार्यं करोति। सेंटर फॉर एन्शियंट हिस्ट्री एंड कल्चर इत्यत्र बेंगलुरु नगरे। युवचेतना वर्गे भवतः कृते स्वागतं महोदय।
नमस्सभायै सर्वेभ्यः नमस्काराः। ॐ दिक्कालाद्यनवच्छिन्नानन्तचिन्मात्रमूर्तये स्वानुभूत्येकमानाय नमः शान्ताय तेजसे। अद्य भवद्भिः साकं मेलितुम् अपि च किञ्चिदिव संवादमपि कर्तुं मम उत्साहः। अहं दृष्टिपटलं संविभाजयामि, शेर् करोमि, अनुमतिं यच्छन्तु।
एकनिमिषं महोदय।
भगिन्या उक्तमासीत्, I was told that there are a few here in the audience who wouldn't, it would help to translate this to English. So I have translated my slides to English. शक्यते इदानीं दृश्यते खलु?
आं महोदय।
अस्तु। अद्य I wanted to talk about in ancient India, not today, okay, but primarily in ancient India, how did people think? Okay, when we talk of history of science, was there a method to the thinking? And very shortly, I'll tell you why this is important. And so what we are essentially trying to do is Bharatiya Itihasasya Vastavikam Vishleshanam. So empirically, what really happened? How did, so if at all we are talking about history of science, we want to see Vastavikam, what it was. And there's going to be some amount of paramarshaha, analysis also, hopefully, if we have enough time and if some of you are enthusiastic about it. So I'm going to speak for about 40 to 45 minutes. And then hopefully we have time to discuss. And it's a small group here, so I'm hoping some of you will actively try to engage and share your experiences. What I am sharing with you is not something that is widely known, is not something that I knew all along. This is something that I started learning only a few years ago. So this is still fresh in my mind. and a lot of things, a lot of these are actually new to me. So some of the people that I learned these things from are here. Except one, all of them are scientists. One was a rocket scientist. He's holding a rocket in his hand. And yeah, one is a mathematician, another is a civil engineer, and so on. So when we talk of history of science, right, there are two ways to look at it. One is what all did the ancient people know? It's after all about history. So we look at past and think what all did they know? And when it comes to Indian history of science, we are bombarded on WhatsApp, on internet, on so about claims, right? There are a lot of claims. The one explanation that funny explanation that I hear is it's a wounded civilization. So when you try to stand up, you try to jump. It's like a spring, suppressed spring. It goes all the way on the other side, and it doesn't care about whether it's really true. It all cares about if it has emotional appeal, and then you go ahead and claim whatever you want, you think will emotionally appeal to you. And so that is about talking about what all did they know. But today, let us look at how did they actually think. So that's the second way of looking at history of science, about the method, about the epistemology, about the paddhati. Sanskritena vayam paddhatihi iti vadamaha. Chintana paddhatihi. Tasya pramana paddhatihi iti nama. In Sanskrit, it is called pramana paddhatihi, very ancient terminology. In English, it is called epistemology. So let us look at that today. But before we look at history of science, or one of the primary anchors to leverage from, to start learning from, would be the economic history of the world, in this case of India. So there is a well-known study, we all know that. This happened in the 90s, sponsored by the United Nations, where all the data was collected. It was a very big, large project, collecting all the data, historical data, and for 2,000 years, almost, they were able to produce the economic history, and what the results were quite surprising. I mean, especially to me as well as to most people, because in my personal memories, family memories, right? I know my dad, and he was utterly poor. He was in poverty. He grew up in poverty. And I speak to my grandfather, who actually lived during my childhood. All he talks of is poverty, utter poverty. And even the family legends that we remember, the old memories of what he remembers of his ancestors, is utter poverty. So we don't even have a family memory of the kind of wealth that we are seeing here. And that was very surprising to me. Um, for a long time in the history, till about 1730, India was in the, we had more than 20% of the world's GDP share, and briefly it goes down, then comes back up till about 1850 or so. We had huge amount of wealth. When I say we, I'm talking of India because I live here, and today's subject uh, is shining light on the Indian history of science. So the focus is India here, and it's only very recent. Today's economic configuration is something very, very recent when it comes to the historical time scales. And what were the sources of these wealth, right? So that's a very obvious question, and that has been studied. And here is what experts say. It so happens the agriculture. See, India has multiple you say advantages when it comes to agriculture. This land is extremely fertile. It's the arable land. We have a large percentage of the land which is arable, which is arable means it's suitable for agriculture, and that is not so in rest of the world. We are this part of the world, India and the surrounding regions. You can actually grow um, three times a year. For example, a staple food like rice or wheat, you can actually grow multiple times a year. Once there will be rice, then there will be something else, whatever. So there is a very high arability in the land here. Besides that, India had extremely high agriculture. There was a study that the British government had sponsored in the late, I guess, in the late 18th or the early 19th century by a team of agricultural experts from the US. Yes, from the US, and the report is available online. And they say we came here to recommend what more improvements can be done in Indian agriculture, but we are not able to find any. The hydrological engineering in terms of harnessing water resources, the canals and dams and stuff, it's optimal. There is no way we can improve this. The knowledge of plants and that the biology and understanding of biology of agriculture is at a very high standard. So, and the records are available. The colonial records of India is available. The kind of agricultural output in terms of tons per hectare or acre that we see is mind-boggling, because today with modern technology we are not able to produce that level of agricultural output, except in very few pockets. So we had very high agricultural outputs, and any civilization which has very high agricultural output, all of you will know, will have enough spare time to do other things. For example, India was also very high in export trade, and the evidence for export trade from India goes to 4,200 years ago. So there we find Indian goods in Mesopotamia, that is Middle East. We find it in the Horn of Africa and some other parts of Arabia and in the northern regions. So you might have heard of the Harappa and Mohenjo-daro culture, uh, the Saraswati and Indus Sindhu civilization. Sindhu is the Indian name, and the Greek name is Indus. The Sanskrit word for Greek is actually Yavani, and Greece was called Yavana Desha, and this is not a Sanskrit name. Incidentally, this is very close to what Greece or the Ionian Greece called itself by that time. So the Indian tradition, this is digressing, but a small snippet is that the Indian tradition is to use what do you call endonyms for if somebody calls themselves by a name, we use the exact same name to refer to them, unlike the tradition followed in English. English creates, coins new names. It calls something as Egypt. They don't call themselves Egypt. They call themselves Misra. We call Germany, whereas they call themselves as Deutschland, right? So, but in Sanskrit and in Indian languages, the tradition is to always refer to everybody and everything by its autonym, by its own name. Anyway,
Mahodaya,
yes.
Kshamita, I don't know if you meant, so you're just wanted to let you know your PowerPoint is stuck to first slide unless you were moving it. We were not moving it intentionally.
Is it? Wasn't it
Yeah.
visible? I didn't understand.
Yeah, it was not. Now it's visible. It moved to the next slide.
Oh, okay. I'll try that again. Is this visible?
Yeah.
Okay. So then we had, if you read Panchatantra, the first story of Panchatantra goes into details of Duradesha Bhandanayanam, that is export trade, and how benefits and what are the methods and what goods have to be traded in export. So we had huge amount of wealth. Then the third is this wealth is not sufficient if you are into war all the time. So there was immense social order and stability. And how did that happen? And in Samskrita, the word for sustainability is, anybody can take a guess? What's the word for sustainability? It's very ancient. It's in the Vedas. Okay, let me surprise you by telling that the closest word for sustainability, and which encompasses not only the modern meaning of sustainability, but everything else that's associated with it, is dharma. Okay, because you are all Sanskrit students, I thought I'll also drop that in. Dharma was also existing in India. Dharyate iti dharma. So something that has dharanam, sustains, something that sustains is called dharma. That is the etymology of that word. Now,
Moshe, we're still seeing the first slide. Sorry.
oh my God, that is
Okay, now
surprising.
I can see. Now it's
So
moved.
let me do it this way. I'll not share. I'll not launch my. Is this? Oh, okay. I
Probably
understand.
when you hit the presentation mode, it's getting stuck in one slide.
I apologize. It was I was sharing the wrong window. Okay, I was here. Is this
Yeah,
visible?
yeah,
Okay, so these are the three sources of the wealth that we were talking about. Now, when we come to the intellectual history of the world, right? Again, this is from what we learn here in India. Perhaps it's the same for what you learn in school. When we look at the technologies of today, the heroes of today, we read about Galileo, Descartes, Gauss, Darwin, Heisenberg. Uh, so all these, and also the technologies that we are using, whether it be it automobiles, the core technologies that made these technologies possible, right? Aircraft, mobiles, computers. A lot of that actually happened in a very small part of the world, what we call Western Europe. Now, was it like this all the time? Was technology being created all the time at this small region? The answer is no. It's very well known that before the 16th century, probably all the way till second century, or we don't see anything, any invention or publication that comes out of this region of Western Europe. And it's very well known in history. We call this the European Dark Ages. And at the end of the Dark Ages, some there was a magical miracle that happened, which is called as the European miracle by historians. And it was only in the last few centuries that there was a sudden spurt of discovery and invention that happens in that small region in the world. What made this possible? This is something strange. Somebody, a set of people who couldn't think or who couldn't come up with stuff, how did all this suddenly explode? What was the source of this? This is something that is being studied. This is not a done deal. The answers are still being researched on. But during this time, okay, so at the end of that, we had. So, how did this? Here is some fine-grained detail on what happened. We know that in the late 15th, 16th century, Niklaus Copernic, this was a person in our textbooks. We read his name as in his Latin name. That was not his real name. In Latina, his name was Nicolaus Copernicus. He said no to geocentrism, and that was shocking to Europe at that time. And then Galileo defied the church for a brief period, and when his life was at stake, he apologized. We know the story. Then there was Bacon. He did a very fundamental thing. He said, "Let us stop thinking like the Greeks, or thinking like how we think the Greeks thought. Let us stop thinking like the Europeans, primarily." And he said, let's look at new epistemology. And even Descartes said, we'll look at barbarians, how they do algebra. The name algebra itself is not an English name, right? I mean, it starts with al, and we know that most words in English which start with al, even similar words like alchemy, algebra, chemistry, antimony, a lot of words. You just have to go look up Arabic words in English, and you'll find a lot of technical words used in science and technology actually are all Arabic words. So algebra also happens to be Arabic. That was Eastern to Europe, and Eastern barbarians would use this word, and Europe said, let us adopt this word. Let us adopt this new method of doing thought and mathematics. And from then onwards, it just exploded. The moment this was done, a new way of thinking, a lot of new technologies, um, and uh, what we see today about modern science happened in Europe during, and all this is very well documented. Uh, During this time, okay, there's another side note. Joseph Needham looked at China in particular. He was I think he was in Harvard, and he said, why did this happen in Europe and not in China and India? And the questions that I'm asking, we are all looking at, was something that people looked at, scientists and historians looked at about 50 to 70 years ago. And we are slowly starting to understand this. And the answer is kind of answered in the case of China. But with India, there's hardly any primary historical research going on with this, with the country with such a long history. That's very unfortunate that the number of dedicated historians working in India is very small. But that was also because of our poverty, and when you're poor, you would want to get a good job rather than go do history, right? So I'm hoping that with economic recovery of India, economic growth that is happening in India will sustain, and there will be more people looking at all this. I used to be in the software industry myself in the US. I retired a few years ago. That's what enabled me to actually start studying this. That was my personal. So hopefully there will be more people, more funded research happening in this area. So what was happening in the rest of the world? And of course, our focus is not rest of the world; it's India. In India, looks like there was no dark ages. So the period marked in blue is the European Dark Ages. During the European Dark Ages, looks like there was no dearth or absence of scientific output from India. And this is not just true for India, this was true for Arabia, the Middle East, and this is also true for China, the other major civilization. So in India, if you see before that period, there was a string of scientific discoveries that was going on, and it continued. It was the same even after that. And and I think my set, those red arrows are the representatives of the small box that I have, the list of discoveries and the inventors, scientists. In India, the word for scientist is actually Rishi, right? So the word Rishi is very confusing. Not Rishi, I mean, there are many words, but Rishi is one of them. Primarily, Rishi is something who is a mantra drashta, uh, who who saw the Vedic mantras. But then there were a lot of such people, right? There were Munayaha, Sadhavaha. So there were a lot of these people, and we confuse. And we celebrate, we being a country who celebrate knowledge, we don't differentiate knowledge, whether it is empirical, scientific, and non. If it's Paravidya and Aparavidya, we say he still is a student, he still got blessed by Saraswati, the goddess of knowledge. So there is no differentiation. So that being the case, it's kind of confusing. But we, being living in the modern world, for us to understand, I'm just calling all of them scientists, whether it is Panini, Parashara, Sushruta, Manuhu, Shankara, Sridhara. So all these people are all Kamalakara Bhatta, Jagannatha Pandita, Mahendra Suri, all of real scientific work. They published scientific work as we can see them today. The other surprising thing there was the gunpowder cottage industry, and the Chinese records state that gunpowder went from India to China in the 6th century, and India was the world's only probably supplier of gunpowder till about late 18th century. This was something new to me. I didn't know, and they never told us in school. So a lot of new things also came up here. But the point was just that there were no dark ages here. So how did this happen? Of course, there was dark ages in the last 150 years in India. So that's the sad black mark that is in the end of the timeline. There's hardly any fundamental scientific output in the last 150 years. And that also coincides with the economic fall of India, right? I mean, I was talking to you about my family memories of poverty, and that that kind of creates an opacity. Who would care to think about what you worked on. Who would think of science when you don't have anything to eat and you're going to die tomorrow? So that's something looks like something like that has happened that created a opacity in the memories, civilizational memory of India. So nobody would even remember these things. This obviously will not be common knowledge unless you go seek for evidence. Anyway, so we have a lot of evidences of not only in scientific publications in India, also of foreigners who had something to do with India, visited India or whatever, and documented these things. So I'll go briefly spend here. So we have Al-Khwarizmi. In fact, if you know the English word algorithm, that comes from this person's name. He's Al-Khwarizmi, and when his name got translated to Latina, both in Cordoba in Spain and in later on the Jesuit translations in Kerala and also in Vatican. So anyway, his name was translated as Algoritmus, which later on in English became algorithm. So today, when you need to multiply two numbers, large numbers, we have a method, right? You don't actually go sit and add it so many times. Multiplication, even though is repeated addition, you don't actually repeatedly add stuff. You can actually, there is a shorter method to do it. So that is called an algorithm, and that is what is used in in computer science and programming. So the, the short methods actually were translated by Al-Khwarizmi's book. Al-Khwarizmi lived in the Middle East. He wrote in Arabic. So he also translated a lot of Sanskrit books. And for example, Hisab al-Hindi, which is calculation using Hindu numerals, Hindu meaning Indian, right? The word Hindu traditionally referred to India, and that is a Arabic Arabic modification, corruption of the word Sindhu. Sindhu was the river, so we all know this. So then there is Leonardo Pisano. Leonardo Pisano was an Italian mathematician who lived in Cairo, who lived in Egypt. His dad used to work there, so he actually moved along with his dad. He was in Egypt, so Egypt had direct access to India. There are a lot of merchants, business relationship with India. Europe was kind of dark. Nobody went there. It was in poverty. But Egypt would trade with India. That was the Arab world. And he met with a lot of Indian merchants. He had access to Indian texts and books. So he wrote a book on Liberabaci numero indorum. And that was his name was later on, very recently, just about 200 years ago, people started calling him Fibonacci. And that is the name that we all learn in our mathematics in our school. His actual name was something else, Leonardo Pisano. Anyway, so he writes about Indian numbers and he comes up with what we today call Fibonacci series. That's basically a translation of what he learned from the Indians. And that is all well known because his book is available now. And the critical edition of his primary manuscript is happening as we speak in Italia, in Italy. And that's how we know that his source was India. Anyway, so Said al-Andalusi, he lived in Spain. He makes this statement: eight peoples have interested themselves in sciences: Hindus, Persians, Chaldeans. Chaldeans is Middle East. Hebrews, Yahudas, basically. Then Yavanas, that is Greeks, Romakas, and Misras, that is Egyptians, and Arabia. So out of this, he says the premier in sciences is that of the Hindus. Looks like the Indians were very famous as being scientists. So when it comes to science, it was the Indians. So it looks like that was the kind of impression that the world had. Al-Biruni, incidentally, actually came to India along with an invader called Mahmud Ghazni, and he has documented quite a bit of Indian science. And he also, Mahmud Ghazni tried to convert Indians. He was quite successful. He destroyed a lot of our heritage. But so Al-Biruni writes quite disparagingly. So you'll have to discount him for that. But you can actually you can actually observe what he writes about his observations, and you get a lot of information out of that. What made all this happen? What made all this happen? So we now come to the method part. That was the introduction. Takes half of the time. So One word that we keep seeing in Sanskrit literature is the word called Yukti. Okay, and some of you, anybody from anybody whose parents were Malayali here in the audience. So in Malayalam, one of the languages in South India, I figured the word Yukti is actually used even today. Yuktivadigal, they say. Yuktivadam. So they use this word. This is a very common word in ancient India, and let us see what it means. But here is a quote from a well-known 2500 years. The older we go, older than, say, the fourth century of the Christian era, uh, the dating of texts becomes very amorphous. You can't get a precise date, and that was the Indian tradition. The authors would hesitate to talk about themselves. They don't talk about themselves at all. We have to figure them. We have to determine the author as well as the date using other evidences, not from primary evidence, not from direct mentions. So Charaka Samhita, we approximately think he lived 2,500 years ago, 500 BC. We don't know. We're not sure. Maybe some call it 200 BC, some call it 100 AD. Yeah. So he makes this statement: "Yuktif pashyati ya bhavan bahu karana yogajan yuktis trikala sadhyeya trivarga sadhyate yaya." In verse, he is now at the introduction to his work on medicine. He informs his students that let us use Yukti. Let us use Yukti as our method of doing science, of doing medicine. He says because Yukti helps us to understand Trikala as well as Trivarga. Okay, so it is Bahukarana Yogaja. So, no, sorry. Yukti helps us see or determine uh, all the relationships of all the reasons for the actions. Okay, it helps us um, sees the emergence of all the combination of all the causes. So causation or etiology is something that we'll understand using Yukti. And it is Trikala. So it is useful. It was useful in the past. Our ancients used it. It is useful in the present. It will be very useful for people who will come in the future. That is me and you, right? We are all in the future to Charaka. So he's talking about us as well. So he says Yukti is useful for all the Trikala and it will help us achieve Trivarga. So in the Indian tradition, there is this concept of Trivarga. So there is a concept of Purushartha. Okay, if you have studied Abraham Maslow lived in New York about 100 years ago. So he came up with Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Every human being has fundamental needs, right? Primary needs, and then he puts that in a hierarchy, and that's appears to be an elaboration of the Indian method of Purushartha. And later on, I figured he is a student of Carl Jung, and Carl Jung also studied Buddhism and Indian traditions. So it could be Indian. I don't know. I wouldn't know. But it seems very similar to the Indian way of thinking of human beings have primary needs, and there is a hierarchy of that. The fundamental artha, which is the material needs. Then comes the kama, which is the human interpersonal needs. And then there comes the dharma, which is needs of virtue, needs of uh, self-actualization. So these needs put together are called trivarga. And these are basic needs of human being. There is a need outside of all this, which only a small percentage of human beings will experience that need. That is called moksha, and that is called apavarga. So it's not considered as normal to have such a need because it's called apavarga, but it is normal for the rest of the human beings to have these set of needs. That is called trivarga. So he says any of these human needs can be achieved using yukti. That's the very strong statement made by Charaka here. Um, Unless you have any questions, yeah, we are in the middle of this. So let me stop for a minute and ask anybody, you want to make any observation, statement, anything wasn't clear? Okay, I take it you're all fine. So let me proceed. Then, having seen this from Charaka, it's not just that. I mean, there are a lot of mentions of Yukti and its synonyms. For example, Charaka, he says, when you're understanding medicine, when you're doing medicine, Vina tarkena ya siddhir yadricha siddhireva sa, he says. So he says, a doctor can be successful and cure a patient, but you know what? It could be accidental. Unless you can logically explain, tarka, logic, you can explain how this actually came about, and if you can reproduce this for another patient, it is of no use. That is what Charaka says. I will call it accidental. So this is an advice to his students. The another statement is Sukham samagram vijnane vimale cha pratishtitam. So all happiness can be found in vimalam vijnanam, that precise science. Vishishtam jnanam is the traditional etymology. Modern, today we use the word vijnana to refer to science. But all the happiness is actually based on that. Then here is another Siddhir Yuktau Pratishtitam. Achievement, success actually is based on Yukti, not in anything else. So why he even goes to say that Dravya Jnana, which is pharmacology, Dravya Jnana is pharmacology. So he says if a doctor is very good in medicines, he has a very good knowledge of all the medicines, he says he is still not he's not a good doctor. A good doctor is one who has a good Yukti, who is adept in Yukti, not adept in medicines. He need not know all the medicines, but if he is good in Yukti, I will call him a good doctor. Excuse me. Then Sushruta, another medicine man, and he is a tall for his publication, Sushruta Samhita, which is considered older than Charaka, so maybe 800 BC, we don't know, maybe older. There's no way to precisely date him, but we know that he's very old. And there is a way to even know the language is older, it doesn't use modern words, it doesn't use Greek words. These are very, very old books, right? So Sushruta says, Shrutayaschaitana karanam yukti virodhat is a very powerful statement. What he says is Shruti, which is authoritative knowledge. What is authoritative? Example of authoritative knowledge, Vedas, right? Veda is considered Shruti. And Shruti is something authoritative because there is no other evidence to validate what it says. Even if Shruti says something, but if the information is opposite of Yukti, if it is contradictory to Yukti, Yukti Virodham, then he says, don't consider it. Don't consider Shruti. Yukti is more important. Sushruta, I'm sure, was a very traditional Vedic scholar, but today, because we are influenced by religions, right? Whether religion existed in India is a point of question. I would argue there was no religion in India as we understand today. Today we know of religions, and the three major religions, Abrahamic religions, Christianity, Islam. So influenced by that, we are all colonized, mentally colonized, we Indians and the rest of the world. This is something that we are hard to, I found it very hard to understand why he says this. Don't believe Shruti if it is opposite of Yukti. Anyway, the other statement is by Nilakantha. Here is an example that I take out of a different field. This is out of an astronomy publication in the maybe 14th, 15th century. This person lived in Kerala. We don't know where Sushruta and Charaka lived, perhaps North India. Nilakantha says,
Etat sarvam yukti moolameva natvagama moolam. This is not from Vedas. What I am going to teach you is actually completely out of Yukti. I am not deriving this out of any authoritative text. And and he says, Sarvajnanam parikshayaiva. Everything has to be verified, he says. So this is a peek into how these people in these various scientific texts thought. And the great rishis of yore used to think. So Yukti is today translated as rational thinking in Indian languages. Even in China, in Kerala, the example I said, where they use this word even today, Yuktivada means rationalism. And I gave you examples from pre-BC, from a BC period. Here is an older example. This is a manuscript that we collected in my research center. This is not published. The manuscript is about 400 years old, but it has been copied. We are able to date the actual contents of this. There is a chapter in this which is actually dated to 1400 BC, much older than the other evidences that I showed. There is a chapter in this that is dated to about 800 BC as well. So this is a village encyclopedia from a very ancient period that has come to us from repeated copying of manuscripts called Vriddhagargiya Samhita. The author of this is called Vriddhagarga. And there is something that I wanted to show in the second line, which says, observation and experimentation, which is basically pratyaksham, along with mathematics and inference, should be employed in order to understand reality. So he's actually talking about what we today in science consider as the modern way of thinking. He says, nahi sarvatra ganitam, nahi sarvatra darshanam. Don't use only experimental, only observation. No, don't use that. You may make mistakes. Don't use only logic. Don't use only inferences, mathematics. Use both of these together in order to clearly understand reality. So that is what Vriddhagarga is telling his students here. This happens to be a chapter on moon's movement in this particular text. And it's not only in 1400 BC, even the ancient text of the Vedas. Okay, when did Vedas get created? We don't know. The traditional Mimamsakas and the Vedantis in the school of thinking in India, they think that Veda was eternal. That is the traditional understanding today. So we don't know when Vedas got created, right? There are a lot of attempts to date the Vedas, and looks like the Samhitas are all collections. So they probably got, if at all you think they got created or seen, because it was considered that they existed and the rishis saw it. So when they saw it, looks like they were seen over a large time period. It didn't come up in one instant, looks like, because the knowledge in it is kind of layered. So here is a portion called Taittiriya Aranyakam, which is a later appendix to the Taittiriya Samhita, part of the Vedas, which says Smrtif Pratyakshamaityam Anumanaschatushtayam Etairaditya Mandalam Sarvaire Vavidha Asyate. So this book we have dated, I mean, some portions of this particular I don't want to call it book, because this wasn't, Vedas were never written, they were all oral. So yeah, book loosely. So this one, we have dated portions of it to 3000 BC. So it could be older, we don't know. So we don't know where from this is. But what it actually is telling is, to understand the solar system, here, this is a chapter on the solar system. To understand the solar system, you need 4 tools. What are these 4 tools? I have ordered it based on the Nyaya Shastra, but you need direct observation, experimentation, right? Second one is logical inference, and Anumanam is a word that is used for logical inference as well as for mathematics, because mathematics in India is fundamentally empirical, unlike the mathematics of the West. So that is the second one, second tool. The third tool that you need to understand the solar system completely are ancient old records. Okay, smritihi. Then lastly, you need aitihyam, legends. These are not verified records, but then you hear from your ancestors that looks like there was something happening like this. The sun was rising near this hill. Now it doesn't rise near that hill. It moves. It seems to have moved, or it was rising near that star. A lot of that information comes as legends today, stories and legends and all that, personified a lot of times. So that's when it gets preserved. So stories gets preserved than data, right? Data gets lost, but stories get preserved and transmitted. So these legends are also important, he says, this author says. So these are the 4 tools. And today in science, these are the 4 tools we use, right? So primarily, this is what the Vedas are also saying. That was very interesting. So, and why are we only talking of science? What about other things like the philosophy? Again, I'm using the word philosophy loosely. Philosophy means something else, whereas our darshanas mean something else. They're only loosely related. We have to be very careful in using English terms for Indian concepts. And we may be overlaying, we may be misunderstanding. And, there are a lot of examples of that. A priest is a word that we use, and there is no concept of priest in ancient India, right? So we didn't have priests at all, not in the way that we know today. So we have to be very careful in using English words. The word purohita, if I were to precisely translate it, I have to go to Indonesia and Bali, where they translate the word purohita as ritual leader. That is exactly what a purohita is. He's a leader. Purastisthati iti purohitaha. When I'm doing marching, when I do march past, there is a person in the front. He doesn't salute. He's just walking straight. The rest of them salute. So this is a purohita. Person who stands in the front is a purohita. So it is not a priest. Then archaka is also translated as priest. And archaka is actually a paid servant or a paid employee to do work because I'm not free to do what he's doing. Anyway. So we have to be very careful with using English. Coming back, so I don't want to use philosophy for darshana, like Vedanta is a darshana. We have darshana, Vedanta is one of the darshanas. Today, loosely, people use philosophy, people throw words, English words, left and right, they use spiritualism, spirituality. There is no such thing in India, right? We have to be very careful when we use those words. So here is a work of Vedanta by Adi Shankara. When he's explaining to his students, he says, if the Vedas tell that the fire is wet and it is cold, do you believe it? Do you believe Vedas just because Vedas tell that? Obviously, no. If it is contradictory to evidence, you don't accept Vedas. That's how it is. This is Adi Shankara telling that, right? So this is an example from Vedanta outside the other scientific books that I was showing you from. Now, there is also a long tradition. What's the time now? Okay, I'm going to stop now. There seems to be a long tradition of reviewing scientific literature. Varahamihira reviews 5 scientific books before his time in the 6th century, and he ranks them on accuracy. And he proposes his own conclusions. And Parashara, in the 8th century, Gujarat, Varahamihira lived in Madhya Pradesh, in the central India. Parashara lived in Gujarat, today's Gujarat. He reviews these same scientific, he's a student of Varahamihira. 200 years later, he comes from the same tradition. And he reviews them and says, no, Acharya, Varahamihira Acharya did that review, but I don't think that is right. And let me do a reorganizing of that. And this seems to be going on. And Nilakantha, who lived in the 15th century, he says, scientific Siddhantas, that is works of science, they over time they become outdated. Paraspara viruddhascha siddhanta bhavanti. They become outdated. They become not relevant to the current reality. Looks like there is something that is happening. So abhinava siddhanta pranaya, new scientific theories and publications have to be done. And he says, if a scientist, if a student doesn't do this, he will be ridiculed in this world. If he doesn't do review of past work, he will be ridiculed in this world. Not only that, he will be punished in the next world when he goes to heaven or hell or whatever. In the next world, he will be punished. So he better review scientific work. This seems to have been the tradition, one of the traditions that we can recognize from the astronomy scientific work. And we also have Kumarila Bhatta, who is a great Mimamsaka. Mimamsaka is another darshana, loosely philosophy. So he talks of how traditions are maintained. He says the strength of a tradition is because not only that it is transmitted all through generation to generation, but also because it is continuously correlated, tested against reality, and readjusted, made finer changes so that it is matching with reality of the current time. So the currency of a tradition is what gives it its strength. Because traditions continuously are changed to make it current, it gives its that is the cause of its authoritativeness. Here is an English translation of what he says. So that's all I have to share now. So I want to conclude. Some of you might be from SoCal, Southern California. Here is something that happened in Caltech many years ago, many moons ago. Here is a photograph between Paul Dirac, who thought like a Greek, and Richard Feynman, who said, the word Indian is mine. I mean, he didn't call himself Indian. He didn't even know that his method of thinking was Indian. He thought it was Arabic. He thought it was Middle East. So he called it Eastern. He said, Richard Feynman would say, when asked about thinking, he would say, I am an Easterner. That's what he would say. Both are great scientists. But the first method is, so the Western method, now here is where I am going to contrast. The Western method, do I have some 10 minutes? I mean, not to speak. Do I have a few more minutes to speak? And then do we have time for conversation as well? Smita?
Yeah.
Okay, good. So there are two ways of doing science is what we learn. The traditional European way is actually to look for beauty in the explanation. So it's the European way to say, you know what, guys, mathematics is beautiful. Mathematics is perfect. It's beautiful. It's the language of the nature. It's the language of universe. Have you heard these statements? No Indian scientist has made that statement. He says, mathematics, yeah, useful, yeah, like anything else, it's a tool. So I use it. Sometimes it's very ugly, it's painful, but it's very useful. So Indian method is to always look for use, purpose, prayojanam. If it's useful, I'll use it. Otherwise, there is no special value in itself. I don't want to call it anything. I don't want to call mathematics beautiful because it's not. A lot of people hate mathematics. So how can it be beautiful? So how can equations be beautiful? An Indian would say, I worship the phenomenon. And that's exactly what Feynman tells. He says, I worship the phenomenon. So I observe nature. The purpose of science is to explain nature. Purpose of science is not that science is great. No, science is not great. Nature is great. Nature is the ultimate thing we are trying to explain. We are trying to understand. Science is just a tool. So explanation is only temporary. Humans created explanation. Humans create science. The phenomenon is amazing. Phenomenon is eternal. That is what Feynman would say. And Paul Dirac would say, my equations are smarter than me. And Feynman would say, no, equations are dead, man. I mean, today they're working and tomorrow there might be somebody else, like what happened with Newton, classical mechanics. And then later on, Newton was a Christian clergyman, right? He was a hardcore Christian clergyman, very full belief in Christianity. So when he so-called discovered, we don't know whether he discovered or he copied it from somewhere, but when he had these laws of mechanics, equations of mechanics, he thought that was a divine revelation that God is giving him. And he thought that God controls the universe using divine laws. And that's the reason he called it laws. niyama. In India, no scientist would use the word niyama. In fact, there is no word for grammar in India. The word vyakaranam is not grammar. I mean, we use English terms loosely, so you need to be careful. So there are no rules of grammar in India. There are no rules. No. Vyakaranam, no, it's not rules. So what is Vyakaranam? Read it. Patanjali has written, Vyakaranam is a collection of characteristics of good speech. That is Vyakaranam. It's just characteristics. I just document how very efficient speakers, very good speakers, how they speak. I just document them instead of rules. That is Vyakaranam. There is no law, there is no, it's not a rule to say, I'll hold a stick and then beat you if you don't follow that. No, no such thing. So, whereas Newton thought that they were divine laws, and that's the reason we call it laws of mechanics. It's not a law. It's just a human, very primitive, V equals U plus AT. The velocity is equal to initial velocity plus into multiplied times acceleration into time. What's that? It's just a primitive human way of trying to predict velocity. That's it. I mean, it works. Yeah, it works most of the time, but not all the time. It doesn't work in quantum mechanics, but it works most of the time. So this was the Indian approach to understanding the equations. So yeah, having said that, that hope you have understood the contrasting. So these things, this adherence to empirical evidence, adherence to think that humans are just a product of nature. How can a product of nature try to understand nature? He'll never be able to. The Gödel's, today we have if some of you are the students of science, you know Gödel's theorem, right? You can never understand everything. And you know Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. So these are, modern science is realizing that you are a product of science, you meaning human being. You can't understand nature. You're just a product, you're a product of nature. So you can always understand some things in a particular context. That's it. And our equations are valid only in that context. Equations aren't divine revelations. They are human made. So, and when we try to understand, we always, as long as we are always looking at empirical evidence, we will make sure when our equations are falling flat, when they're failing, right? We will be protected from that. So yes, with that I stop. I hope it wasn't way dense. I know it is very dense. I try to tell you a lot of things in a very short period of time, so you'll have to pardon me for that and feel free to ask questions.